Hi, I'm Dan Fay. Today I'll be presenting our trial measuring harvest losses in the Albany Port Zone. So a quick project overview. This project aimed to measure harvest losses across three key crop types: pulses, cereals, and oilseeds. The losses were measured across a range of different headers and different fronts. Yields ranged anywhere between 0.5 of a tonne a hectare to 6.5 tonnes a hectare. So it was a very wide range of crops that were measured as well. And when measuring, we collected a range of variables to provide context to the results. These included things such as straw conditions, weather conditions, humidity, atmospheric conditions, machine setup, machine settings, header front settings, stubble height, crop height, and a few others. To measure these losses, we utilised the Bushel Plus system, and we measured both front and machine losses to give a reading of the total losses and being able to provide farmers with greater information and insight. So in the paddock where we took these losses, these measurements I should say, we then provided direct feedback to the farmers as to what their level of losses were and where they were losing, grain. And then we tried to make adjustments to rectify this if the losses were outside what is deemed to be an acceptable level in the paddock, so these could then be recorded again in real time to quantify the difference that changes that were made to the header or to settings or sieve settings or anything, to record the differences in real time that they made to the harvest losses. So the results from the pulses. The total losses on pulses were higher than the other crop types. There's a few reasons behind this. One is that the average yield for pulse crops in 2021 was really quite good all across the Albany Port Zone. Machine losses on pulses were really low. This well and truly falls within an acceptable level. And this is because most farmers had a pretty good idea on how to set up their machine and their sieve settings to prevent losses in pulse crops. Where the losses were higher, the farmers generally accepted this level of losses as well, saying that, well, this is good sheep feed essentially, and that pulses were deemed to be a less important crop within the program. So if they were harvested in not ideal environmental conditions, then this was also deemed as acceptable. The front losses from pulses, they were a bit harder to be able to adjust on the site, on the flow. So that's why we saw a fairly high percentage of front losses. And this was due to often losing whole pods in lupins and faba beans. So instead of having seeds fall to the ground that you might expect in canola or in cereals, whole pods were getting lopped off when they were hitting the front. And there was very little that could be done or adjusted in the paddock to prevent this from happening, other than maybe adjusting the environmental conditions, factoring in the environmental conditions all the time of when you harvest these crops, that there's enough straw strength there that it's not going to shatter upon impact with the front. So, as I said, environmental conditions played a fairly major role in the losses, where when the straw was brittle and the pods were brittle, you're seeing a lot of them just fall off in front of the header front. Which type of front you use did seem to make a bit of a difference, with tin fronts and draper fronts probably handling the losses about the same, unless where we saw a quite steep draper angle. So if there was a steeper draper angle, you're getting a lot of pods bouncing off the front of the draper and then falling to the ground, which were getting registered in the harvest losses. The majority of farmers, I would say, though, were fairly surprised with how little they were losing. I think there was a general acceptance that maybe they might be losing up around that 10% mark, but as you can see, the average total losses was around 5%. And where they were higher, once again, that was generally where they were harvested in not ideal conditions, and even then, the farmers were expecting that they would be losing a higher percentage than what they were. Moving on to cereals. The average losses for cereals were quite high. However, this was exacerbated by a stripper front that was not set up 100% correctly for barley. That was what recorded really high losses that then has kind of blown out the averages. So that kind of needs to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. We found with the stripper front that the losses were really high in the front losses because it was hitting the crop too hard, or there was uneven crop height, and where the stripping mechanism was going through, it was kind of popping off heads rather than pulling them all in. Granted, this was a very heavy crop as well. So where you were losing a lot in grain, when you factored it back to an actual percentage of yield, once again, it was probably lower than what we expected to see in the paddock. When you go pick up your drop tray and there's, 7 or 8 whole heads in there, you'd expect this to be completely blowing out the losses altogether. However, when they were factored into the fact that this crop was yielding around 6.5 tonne a hectare, the losses themselves on a percentage basis weren't too high. Our fear was, though, that you'd be experiencing similar losses on a lower yielding crop that would really blow out that percentage, because it seemed that there was more a mechanical effect from the stripper front that was causing these losses rather than the high yield. Across the rest of the cereal crops that were recorded, the average losses were low for both machine and front losses. Where some low yielding crops were factored in, there seemed to be a bit of a flaw to the losses as well. So in a low yielding crop, particularly with machine losses, you would get a level of losses that you couldn't get below that would naturally be carried through the machine. So when you then got a crop that was only yielding 1.5 tonne, then that loss on a percentage basis was a lot higher than what you would be expecting. As you can see from the photo here, that 0.8 grams is not a lot, but when you factor that through a low yielding crop, that can then blow itself out to around the 1-2% mark. Farmers felt that they had a strong understanding of how to set up their machines for cereals as well. So most people were fairly confident that their machine losses were going to fall within an acceptable level, which is what we observed. Most farmers were below 1% to 2% at highest for machine losses. And with front losses, it really was variable depending on a lot of external factors that were impacting the crop. We found that heat and hot weather particularly exacerbated front losses in barley, where you had a lot of heads falling off when they were hitting the front, kind of irrespective of what header front was being used. Finally, canola. Harvest losses on canola on a whole were quite low, especially given the variability in yields. So we found that with tin fronts, there was almost no front losses to be found at all. And then with draper fronts, they were a bit higher when you're direct heading. And then with pickup fronts, there was always going to be a bit of losses as well. And as anyone who's driven a header with a pickup front on, you can hear the grain bouncing off the glass quite often. So there are losses as well that could not be recorded through the drop tray system. So even though they were quite low, generally sitting around that 1% mark when using a pickup front, these losses, there was an area of these losses that was probably unrecorded as well. Crops with low yields had a larger percentage of losses, particularly machine losses, and there were some really waterlogged crops that were recorded. So you're talking around the 0.5, 0.8 of a tonne mark. So you don't need a lot of grain loss there to, on a percentage basis, be quite high. So once again, there seemed to be a bit of a flaw to canola losses, where you would lose a little bit through the machine, irrespective of how you had it set up. And then if you had a low yielding crop, this would come up as a significant percentage of around that 1.5%, 2% mark, but it might only come up as like 0.1 or 0.2% if it was in a heavier yielding crop. And it almost seemed like there was nothing that could be done or adjusted at that point to remove those final machine losses. Once again, farmers on a whole were very confident in their machine setup for canola, and they found that where there was no or next to no machine or front losses, it tended to be where the ground speed was quite low. And that if you increase that ground speed, that's where you could start seeing your losses push up. So we found that a lot of farmers were sitting below that 4 km/h mark and almost losing nothing at all. So that kind of then comes into a factor of what is an acceptable ground speed, and you kind of have to do your own economics there of if you want to slow right down to reduce your losses next to nothing versus trying to get through your crop a bit quicker. So just a quick discussion on the project as on a whole. So as I said earlier, the harvest losses in the APZ fell well within what was deemed to be an acceptable range, which what is an acceptable range tends to vary from where you look it up and get this information. But as a general rule, it's around the 3% mark for cereals, around the 1.5%, 2% mark for canola. And then for pulses, it can be anywhere between 5% and 25%, depending on where you look to find what is an acceptable level of losses. And within that 5 to 25%, it seems to be the more recent article or study you look at, the lower that percentage is. And my theory behind that is that harvesters have got so much better with their technology at improving harvest losses. Like the machinery has gotten better, so naturally that has come down. There was no notable difference between machines. We didn't see any brand that was particularly higher in losses or particularly lower in losses. There was quite a significant relationship between, though, what front type you used for what crop. So a draper front on canola was obviously caused a lot higher front losses than a tin front on canola or a pickup front on canola. So there is a relationship between crop type and front type where you want to minimize your front losses. Farmers in general had a really strong idea on how to set up their machines to minimize losses, even if they'd never used drop trays before, with probably about 50% of the farmers having used drop trays in the Bushel Plus system going into this project. I was very pleasantly surprised with the farmers that had never used it before, that they still had a very strong idea of how to set up their machine to minimize losses. And that's why I think on a whole, we saw a very low level of losses across the whole district. And final thing that farmers expressed an idea to know is what sort of losses you're getting that post-maturity pre-harvest timing. So where you're having heads and grains fall to the ground. So how that could be factored in to then your machine losses to give you an overall picture of how much you are losing from that post-maturity pre-harvest into your harvest losses. So trying to quantify what your maximum yield could have been if there was no machine losses, no front losses, and none of that pre-harvest losses as well. So that there is something where there could be a potential room to research do more research into going into the future. I'd like to thank you all for listening to this project, and I'd like to thank the GRDC for funding this project and GGA for managing the project. And lastly, I'd like to thank all the participating farmers. I think everyone got a lot out of this. So it was a very enjoyable project to be a part of. Thank you.